Think about this. How might Hollywood tell the story of a chess match? Not of two players facing each other across a game board, but instead the story of what is happening on the board itself. If the chess pieces could be personified, animated, and have a yarn spun about them, through whose eyes might we follow the story of the game? A Hollywood chess flick would no doubt position a heroic pawn as its main character. The more humble a protagonist's origins, the more satisfying their eventual triumph. Picture the story of an undistinguished pawn bravely stepping forward, one square at a time, diagonally slashing its way across the board, facing down knights and rooks before confronting the king in a final battle and emerging victorious. And yet, such a story would also be totally unrealistic to even the most casual chess player. Pawns are almost never used to make the final blow in a winning checkmate, let alone to conquer the entire board. Magnus Carlsen himself would be hard-pressed to win a match using only a single piece, even if that piece were the all-powerful queen. It takes the movement of every node on the board to make a real difference. In chess, like in life, there's no such thing as a main character.
The pawns, man, in the game, they get capped quick. They be out the game early.
This chess as a movie example highlights the shortcomings of Hollywood's favorite kind of storytelling, what we might call psychological storytelling. While most every movie contains some kind of psychology, psychological stories are those that specifically highlight the actions of individuals to drive a narrative. The life of one, maybe two characters is the center of the story universe, around which the entire plot revolves. From Sophocles to Shakespeare to Aaron Sorkin, psychological stories dominate our culture because they feature heroes with whom we identify, villains we love to hate, and a crystal clear distinction between the two. They depict both courage and villainy as a result of a single character's moral fiber. Unsurprisingly, these narratives often work well as moral parables, especially when the morals they promote are relatively straightforward. Don't screw your best friend, don't murder the king, don't murder the king and then screw your mother. The biggest blockbusters, both old and new, are nearly all psychological stories. Whether it's the Iliad from ancient Greece or Star Wars from modern Disney, background characters are almost always shown as helpless and idle masses. It's always the lone hero, or sometimes a small band of them, who saves the town, or the nation, or the universe. These kinds of stories comfort us with the feeling that our greatest challenges can be reduced to the level of a single person, that it is both individuals who cause our problems and individuals who will save us from them.
The prophecy states that you're the most important, most talented, most interesting, and most extraordinary person in the universe. That's you, right?
Yes. That's me.
For most of history, influence was in fact held in the hands of the very few. But today, inventions like fossil fuels, airplanes, the internet, and democracy have complicated things, to say the least. We have entered an age of such complexity, consequence, and power that the biggest real-world problems can't just be solved by kicking a couple of bad guys in the face. The worst issues of our lifetime, global warming, pandemics, resource scarcity, happen to us not because of bad people, but because of bad systems. The problem shows up in the hopes we cast onto our individual leaders and the often simplistic ideas they put forward, whether in the political, technological, social, or religious realms.
How would you bring jobs back to the 14th District?
That's a great question, Carl. Thank you for asking it.
We think eliminating a lone CEO might change the behavior of an entire industry, or that a single billionaire could clean up the government and move humanity to Mars. The very features that make psychological stories great vehicles for basic morality also leave them unable to explain the challenges of our increasingly complicated lives. There is, however, another way to tell a story, one that better captures the way our world actually works. Consider The Hunger Games, in which leaders from the affluent capital force children in the less wealthy districts to fight each other to the death in a televised reality game show. The films are seen largely through the eyes of a teenager named Katniss Everdeen, who becomes a symbol of resistance when she volunteers to replace her younger sister as a tribute in the annual Battle Royale, and eventually emerges as an unlikely victor. Her repeated acts of defiance and rebellion serve as fuel for a social uprising against the capital. At first glance, The Hunger Games looks like it's about Katniss. It seems to be another Hollywood psychological story.
Are you coming to the tree? They strung up a man, they say, who murdered 3.
But take a closer look at the narrative, and we realize that the plot largely happens to Katniss, but not necessarily because of Katniss. Instead, it's a bureaucracy of corrupt politicians who create the rules and circumstances that lead to Katniss's participation in the Hunger Games. Meanwhile, nameless industrial workers are the ones who spark the protests and the eventual rebellion that trap Katniss at the center of a sweeping social revolution. We see the Capitol parading Katniss around the districts at gunpoint to spout pre-written propaganda, and later watch as resistance fighters from the districts depict her as a rebellious hero in their disinformation campaigns. In the series' fourth and final film, Katniss's younger sister is eventually killed when bombs are dropped on civilians during the heat of a climactic battle. Katniss spends 4 movies fighting to save her sister from a corrupt world, and in the end, her efforts amount to nothing. In the last sequence of the franchise, Katniss is even given the opportunity to publicly execute the series' main antagonist, the Capitol's President Snow. But she declines this privilege, and President Snow is instead killed off camera by a crowd of revolutionaries itching to play a part in its justice. The cathartic finale viewers have spent hours building toward is realized not by our protagonist, but by a group of citizens whose names the audience will never know.
Are you coming to the tree? They strung up a man, they say he murdered 3. Strange things that happened here, no stranger would it be. We met at midnight in the hanging tree. Are you coming to the tree?
This erosion of agency from our main character hints to us that The Hunger Games is in fact a sociological story. In contrast to psychological stories that are about individuals, sociological stories are about institutions. While they often still feature psychologically rich characters, these stories are more concerned with the dynamics of broader social systems, primarily by showing us how a character's choices are motivated, influenced, and nullified by the social forces that surround them. It's telling the story of a chess game by watching the entire board. In a sociological story, a character's actions are more likely to come from their positions within a system, rather than who they are personally. They act good or bad not because they are good or bad, but because they are incentivized to behave in accordance with their place on the social chessboard. Katniss and the 24 other teenagers fighting in the Hunger Games maim and murder each other not because they are young sadists, but because they are forced to do so by the institutions that surround them. Had Katniss been born in the Capitol instead of the districts, she likely would have watched the Hunger Games while laughing with a bowl of popcorn in her hands. Characters in a sociological story might still have their own personal tragedies and triumphs, but the dramatic arc of the plot is largely divorced from the emotional ups and downs of any one character. By the end of the first movie, Katniss and her fellow victor Peeta win the Hunger Games, but dozens of other children lay dead, and the system that supports the games is still intact. By the end of the franchise, however, that malignant system has triumphantly collapsed, even though Katniss and so many other characters have sacrificed almost everything that makes their own lives worth living. The fate of the system is entirely separate from the fate of the individuals who live inside it. We might hope that the success of the Hunger Games could encourage executives in Hollywood to produce more of these kinds of stories, but those with greenlight authority in the business don't normally think in terms of psychological and sociological. They think more in terms of simple and complicated. Complicated stories are risky bets. Simple ones are more likely to succeed. Executives motivated by the bottom line believe that a straightforward story will be easier to watch and is therefore more likely to attract a broader viewership. Only a best-selling book like The Hunger Games might prompt an exception to this unwritten Hollywood rule. By pampering us with hero-led fantasies, the entertainment industry has denied us the kind of stories that actually reflect our world, one in which individuals rarely incite change. Our attitudes are largely products of the environments in which we live, and the ways in which we do make a difference are often unconscious and unintended. If we want to tell better stories about topics like climate change, democratic instability, or even something as simple as how the device on which you're watching this was put together, we need more movies to give us a broader scope than the perspective of a single character.
She's only interested in you because she thinks you're the chosen one.
But I am the chosen one.
While most Hollywood stories are psychological, there are other movies that have been both commercially successful while still tilting closer to the sociological end of the narrative spectrum. Among them is the movie The Big Short. Directed by Adam McKay, The Big Short follows a diverse group of Wall Street hedge funders looking to bet against the US housing market, not because they are apathetic and greedy, but because it is their job as responsible finance bros to make these kind of lucrative bets. The protagonists work right alongside the bad guys at the banks who eventually trigger the collapse of the very financial system on which they are gambling. While most of the characters never physically meet, their individual stories nonetheless come together as one big saga of an institution's disastrous collapse.
You just bet against the American economy.
Fuck yeah, we did.
Yeah.
Fuck yeah.
At the end of this story, the main characters make some money and rescue nobody, as is their job. They are not superheroes who save the day. Instead, they helplessly watch as a global disaster beyond any of their individual control unfolds.
I get it. I can feel you judging me. That's palpable. But hey, I never said I was the hero of this story.
This is a very un-Hollywood story, and yet it's also an important true story, one which might help prevent Wall Street from making the same kind of mistakes all over again. The movie not only simplified the complex financial practices that silently dictate many aspects of our lives, but also exposed the bad incentives that encourage reckless behavior by the banking industry, and highlighted the need for better regulations on these professions.
If we don't work with them, they will go to our competitors. Not our fault, simply the way the world works.
We do know that stories impact our minds in deep and primordial ways, and that a broader shift in the kind of stories we consume as a society will change how we see and understand the world in which we live. The choice for filmmakers is not binary. There's a scale between the extremes of psychological and sociological. On one end are purely social narratives, like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series, in which no character appears in more than 2 chapters, and the story leapfrogs by hundreds or even thousands of years between the pages. On the other end are stories that involve only a single character. The best stories often rest somewhere in the middle. My own favorite movie as a child, Titanic, is both a tragic teenage love story and also a parable of how man's hubris can lead to large-scale disaster. But in our increasingly atomized media landscape, the center of gravity has fallen too far to the side of individualistic tales, while ignoring the stories we all share as players walking on this planetary stage. Though this perspective might make for a slightly less exciting lightsaber battle, it does make for a kind of storytelling that is more likely to match our perception of reality or the world we live in, and create a more lasting impact on how we exist on this planet together. The truly heroic deed for us all would be to champion the kind of stories that better reflect the complex, connected, and very often chaotic world that we've made for ourselves. Only then can we use movies to make it better.